conversation will be recorded. And the reason for that recording is for the sake of those who may have registered for this series but been unable to join us. I encourage those who can to be present in real time so we can have some conversation and you can meet one another. But there is always that option of returning to video on the Quaker Leadership Center website later on. Also, you are welcome to take notes, but you will get a PDF of the slides that you're going to see tonight as well. Here's my intention for some of the things that we're going to touch on tonight. This is a little bit of a catch-all evening. It has to do with how we interact with one another in the context of our Quaker meetings or organizations, because there is so often sort of a tug and pull between what is the job of trustees and what is the job of another group of friends and what is the job of the whole community of friends, and how do we talk to one another and work through those things in a way that we can avoid conflict and, really stepping on each other's toes. So we'll start by talking a little bit about the spiritual grounding of policies and procedures in meetings. Then we're going to talk for just a couple of minutes about types of trustee and organizational relationships, because John's relationship between the trustees and the group is not the same as David's relationship between trustees and the group, and that's not, again, the same as it is for Pam or for Mary. So we're going to look at some of those differences. Then taking a look at the relationships between committees and groups in an organization and how that connects with discernment of the whole. And talking about the languages of reports and communications. When trustees or anyone else is making a report to a group of people, how to do that in a way that is most likely to communicate the information you're needing to communicate. And we're going to move a little bit quickly through the evening. And I just want you to remember that if you're feeling like something went too fast and you haven't had enough time to spend with it, you are going to get this PDF later, so you can come back and spend as much time with any page of it that you like. Spiritual grounding of policies and procedures. When we're talking about the ways that we do stuff in Quaker groups, the point of view that I'm coming from is that there's always some kind of spiritual grounding for our practices. And if there isn't a spiritual grounding behind our practice, then we should be re-examining whether we still need that practice. And I want to start by asking you to fill in the blank in this particular sentence. What the sentence says is, we are called to explain our policies and procedures regularly and thoroughly, and then practice them consistently because. If you were going to finish that sentence, how would you do it? And you can either raise an electronic hand or you can throw something into the chat.
I don't know if you can hear me or not. Can you?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I would fill it by saying transparency.
Okay, because doing that provides transparency. Anybody got a different answer? How about Allison and then the person who is called Trustees Committee?
This is similar to people of integrity. It is our responsibility. We must practice them consistently because that is our responsibility to the meeting as a whole.
Okay. And Trustees Committee?
I'm actually not the entire committee, but this is Jerry Hurley from Sandy Spring Friends Meeting in Sandy Spring, Maryland. It's not only transparency, although that's very, very important, but through transparency, we're making ourselves understandable and then also accountable, and that we need to live that life.
So far, I've heard transparency, responsibility, accountability, integrity. Can we dig any deeper and say why? Why are those things important in our communities? Our policies and procedures, I'm looking at the chat now. Our policies and procedures are how we open the way for spirit to move, or because we have none. I think that's a response to, right? I'm not actually quite sure what that's a response to, but the idea of it opening up that idea, the ability for spirit to move through our community. The reason I'm pushing us to see if we can go deeper into this conversation is because this is one of the places where um, we sometimes bump into problems with communications and with relationships within the context of the meeting. It is absolutely true that doing these things is important for reasons of accountability and reasons of integrity, but it is also true that we talk about our policies and our procedures and we practice them consistently so that everybody knows how to participate because we are in a spirit-based faith community. And we want to make sure that there is a way for us to be in that corporate discernment setting together so that we're providing that kind of mutual care and mutual accountability. Some of us would use the language of we are called to love one another. Jesus said, you know, if you love me, love one another. And one of the ways we do that is by making it possible for each other to participate. I think that these are things that everybody on this call already knows. But we don't very often say it out loud in the context of a conversation about something like budgets or trustees. And for some of us, I think it's important to actually articulate that. I'm going to move to a different topic, but is there anyone who's wanting to say something before I do? Darlene?
Please. Yeah. It seems to me that if we have agreed on procedures and ways of doing things, then we can, I mean, I like the idea that it opens up to all people participating, but it also makes it so that you can follow it, you can track it, you can work your way through it. Or if you come into it at a farther down the road level, like join a group that's practicing something, then you'll know that you'll know what the processes are and what the procedures are so that you can step right in.
Absolutely. And I think that what you're saying is reliant on two different factors. One is that there is some kind of procedure in place, and the other is that we are regularly making a point of re-explaining it to ourselves and to whoever in the room might be new, so that that is something that nobody is excluded because they don't know what the process is. Katrina?
I was thinking part of my answer to that might be along the lines of like one of the things Colin shared last month about having a budget and using a budget, and that part of that, it's like a concrete tool that can help us express our values and our mission. And we don't always think of like values and mission as going along with something like a budget, but I think that like policies and procedures can also be concrete things that we have to rehearse or go through consistently to make sure that they're still helping us live out our mission and our vision. Yeah.
That rings really true to me. Each time we're talking about these policies and procedures, it's not really like we do it this way because this is how we do it, but is this process still upholding our ability to live the mission, live the values, live the calling of the community that we're part of? Like, is it still supporting that? All right, one more, and then we'll keep going. David?
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Because I'm in other groups with you, Emily, you know, I'm very influenced by the virtue continuum, which is a lovely idea where you've got all these virtues and you can have a deficiency of a virtue, but you can also have an excess of a virtue. And the virtue I'm thinking of in relation to this question is respect. You want to have respect for your procedures and whatnot. Now, to have a deficiency of that is a disregard. So you're disregarding it, okay? But an excess is idolatry, you know? And so I think we have to be careful not to idolize things that they can never be changed or never be challenged or whatever. So that's my 2 cents worth. Thank you.
Thank you. When I travel around from group of friends to group of friends, I very often run into situations where there are people involved in some kind of conflict. And when there are people involved in some kind of conflict, especially if trustees are part of the conflict, a lot of times I discovered that the origin of the problem was that not everybody had agreement on what the trustee's job actually was. And a lot of times we don't realize that there was that disagreement about the role of trustees until after it has already started a conflict. That's the point at which we become aware of it. So I just want to show you something here. And before you get distracted by the adorable animal and trying to decipher what the animals mean, let me tell you the animals have no meaning. They are not symbols of anything. They're just ways for us to refer to where we are in the chart. The reason I'm giving you this is because the actual relationship between trustees and the meeting or trustees and the organization is different from group to group to group. And I truly do not believe that there is a right answer in terms of how this is supposed to happen in Quaker communities. But what can be really important is that we all know what our agreement is within our particular Quaker community, so that we're clear. So just to give you an example, one of the things trustees tend to relate to is the property of the meeting or the organization, the physical real estate. There are Quaker organizations out there where the trustees have complete autonomy over the property. They make the decisions. They do the discernment themselves about what happens to the property. There are other Quaker communities, this is the camel, where the trustees are sharing autonomy with another committee or group. So the trustees do some of it, but the property committee does some of it, and they're kind of navigating that relationship together. And then there are places where the trustees have some decision-making power over the property. And then the group as a whole, probably the meeting or the organization as a whole, has the rest of the discernment. So there are certain decisions the trustees can make alone, but then many decisions have to be made by the whole meeting. And then there are other meetings, this is the kitty cat, where the trustees have no decision-making authority about property at all. But if the meeting discerns that there's going to be something specific that happens, the trustees have the legal ability to sign the contract or whatever it might be. But they are only doing what the meeting as a whole has asked them to do. We have different relationships when it comes to personnel, and again, when it comes to investments. So your particular meeting might be a camel and a seahorse and a squirrel. Or your particular meeting, you might say, we can be described as a cat and as a penguin, but then when it comes to investments, we are an octopus because the trustees have total autonomy over our investments. Anybody want to give this one a try and tell us what animal or animals do you think your meeting or organization is? And if you don't have any personnel, if there's no staff in your meeting, then you get to skip line 2 altogether. Let's try, oh, I've lost your name already because you're still called Trustees Committee. Tell me again.
Well, again, I'm not the entire trustees committee. My name is Jerry.
Jerry.
And at our meeting, I think the number 3, the trustees have partial autonomy and the body as a whole has the rest. We are tasked with making recommendations, but the decision-making authority belongs to the meeting as a whole in almost all cases, although we have some authorization for signing agreements, contracts, and such.
So pretty much straight down like owl, seahorse, squirrel is a good description for your meeting.
I think so.
Okay. Anybody have a different combination of animals?
Yeah, we have, we're kind of cat, seahorse, squirrel.
Cat, seahorse, squirrel. Okay. And I couldn't see who was speaking in that case. Who was that?
Sorry, that's Tim Yaney.
Welcome, Tim. Sorry, my Zoom was just lagging a little bit and I couldn't figure out whose voice I was hearing. Anybody have a different answer? How about Susan and then Alicia?
I would say that we are a cat. No, we're an owl, a penguin, and an octopus.
Okay. And then one more, Alicia. You'll have to unmute though.
Sorry. I said regarding the property, we would be owl. And for personnel, we would be a penguin. And then for investments, we would be an octopus.
Very cool. So the reason I love this is, for one thing, I like to let you hear each other's answers and hear like we are actually in very different contexts, which again, I'll repeat, means there's not necessarily a right way to do this in a Quaker context. And then also, here's the other question that I want to ask you to just think about for a minute. If you asked the other people in your meeting, people who do not serve as trustees, do you think that they would come up with the same animals? You don't have to answer that question out loud, but does anybody want to? How about Anne Marie and then Susan?
Well, I think that our meeting would like to have everything cat, penguin, fish. But legally, we can't do that because we are responsible for things. So what trustees would like would be to be a koala, dolphin, and octopus. And I think what we end up with is camel, lizard, and crab, because we have to follow policies that have been approved by the yearly meeting. Often we've drafted them, or our agents have drafted them, but it has to be approved by the yearly meeting. So I think it's very hard to say that we're autonomous when we have to follow their policies.
Mhm.
Something that strikes me about what Anne-Marie has just said is that it's pointing out sort of an inherent tension that sometimes exists in that in many Quaker communities, if we didn't legally have to have trustees, we probably wouldn't. That's not the case everywhere, but many of us probably would not, because we like to talk about this corporate discernment concept, and we say like our group as a whole is coming to an understanding of what way forward would be. But there is this legal piece of it, and then also there's the piece about expertise and practicality and what can really happen. And so sometimes there is a tension between who we would wish we would be and who we actually are. Let's go to Susan and then to Ron.
I think the question I heard you ask was, would the folks in my meeting say that what I reported was what they see? And I would like to think so, pretty much, because we've tried. We went through a period probably, I don't know, 40 years ago, where the trustees were totally opaque about everything, and there was a great deal of agitation. And so we have over the period of time, and I'm not a trustee currently, but I have been, really worked to do transparency. The one thing that's not on here is budget. And we merged our stewardship and finance and trustees a number of years ago because we didn't have enough knowledgeable folks. And so the trustees are responsible for, in concert with committees, developing the budget, sharing the budget, and then the treasurer folks monitor it. But we've worked really hard to make all that as transparent as possible. In my experience, most of the people in the meeting want to know that the investments are being managed, and they'd like a report, but they don't want anything to do with doing the management.
And we are going to come back to a couple of those things about budget and about how much do people actually want to know. Those are things we're actually going to touch back in a few minutes. Ron.
Yeah, I can speak to the kind of tensions that you were talking about before Susan spoke about, in that our bylaws at our meeting make it pretty plain that the trustees act at the direction of the meeting, consistent with Quaker faith and practice and all that. So that we don't really make personnel decisions or investment decisions. The investments are bundled up at Friends Fiduciary, and they've just sat there forever. So really, the only thing that we have to think about is that our bylaws say that we are essentially an owl, but our trustees think that they're koalas. And so that you can imagine the kinds of tensions that emerge in business meetings as we sort through that discrepancy of opinions about what we're doing. And it's a challenge. It is. I'll just say that.
Yeah, and although this is, first of all, thank you for that. And what I'm about to suggest is going to sound slightly goofy, but for some of you, it might actually be a helpful tool. There are cases where you can actually show something like this slide to your meeting, and you might discover in the form of, as you're having a conversation, that somebody is saying, I think the trustees are acting like koalas, and the trustees are saying, we are not. We're acting like owls. And there's an opportunity to go a little bit deeper and say, okay, here's what's happening from my point of view, and here's what's happening from mine, and try to get to a place where we actually do kind of understand how we're going to navigate these relationships. Let's keep going because the next piece is actually going to build on this. And this is those relationships between committees and groups. So a lot of us have, in whatever context we're in, we might have a group of trustees We might have a buildings and grounds committee. We might have a finance and stewardship committee. We might have a personnel committee. There is a variety of groups of people that we might have. I'm going to read this out loud to you, so if you're struggling to see it, don't panic. But the question here is, whose job in your meeting or organization is each of these things? And I invite you to answer the question in your head. If you're super excited and you want to write your answers down, you can, but it's not a quiz and I'm not going to make you tell me the answers. You're just trying to respond to this in your head. Is this trustee's job? Is it a committee's job? If it is a committee, which committee is it? Is it a staff job, or is it something that the whole meeting or organization does? And I'm going to say the things out loud. That's what I'm going to do next. Darlene, was that your question, or is it something else?
Our meeting doesn't have trustees.
Okay.
So could you maybe just give us a definition, a little idea of what a trustees group is?
Yes.
What is, I mean, I'm kind of in the black or in the red or in the, ether somewhere.
So as we're going along tonight, I'm going to keep speaking as if your groups do have trustees, but Darlene's point is well taken because there are Quaker meetings that do not. And in some cases, that means that this particular Quaker meeting does actually have trustees, but they're written down somewhere and everyone has forgotten who they are. And in other cases, it means you literally don't have trustees because for some reason in your state, the way you are organized, you don't have to have them. It's not a legal requirement. So there are groups that are under both of those categories. Basically, trustees, from a legal point of view, have a fiduciary responsibility to the organization. So they are responsible to make sure that the things the organization owns are being used for appropriate purposes. And it's a communal responsibility, not an individual one. And then exactly what the trustees do in different groups or meetings varies a lot, which is what we've been talking about. But the essential factor is the legal responsibility. Okay, I've been promising to read these out loud because they're small enough that I know some of you can't see them. So whose job is each of these things in your particular meeting or organization? That's what you're answering in your head. The maintenance of buildings. Hiring or firing staff. Making sure that your expenditures are consistent with your budget. In other words, you're using money how you said you were going to use it. Whose job is maintenance of grounds? Personnel policies. Deciding when and whether you'll spend down the principal of an investment. Whose job is it to buy or sell property? To manage investments. To accept donations if someone gives to the meeting. Whose job is it to manage rentals of your property to other organizations? How about making new financial investments, not managing the ones you already have, but making decisions about new ones? Responding to a lawsuit. If somebody sued you, who would respond to that? Whose job is supervision of staff? Or drafting the budget? Whose job is it to purchase or change insurance? Whose job would it be for your meeting or organization to borrow money? To approve a budget. So if somebody else has drafted it, who approves it? And then lastly, whose job is it to create abuse, harassment, or safety policies for your meeting or organization? Okay, I promised I wasn't going to ask you to answer those questions out loud, and I'm not. But here are the questions I do want to give you a chance to respond to. Just starting with the top one. What's your level of confidence that your answers are correct, that they actually match what your meeting has written down somewhere? Anybody want to be brave and speak to that one? Jerry?
I'm pretty confident that the answers would be correct, that our organization is not that complicated that I would think that there was some chance that I was telling you something that's not true.
Mary, were you raising a hand? It's okay. Okay, you were definitely not. That was a vigorous shake of the head. How about Timothy?
Yeah, I think in most cases, pretty high confidence that our answers are correct. Our roles between the different committees are fairly well defined.
Okay. One more, John.
I'm pretty sure that my answers are correct, but there are one or two of the places where my answer was, I don't think anybody has any idea. Specifically, like who would respond to a lawsuit was one of them.
Yep. Okay, so next question down. Do you think that other people in your community could do this exercise? If somebody else in your church or your meeting or your organization was trying to respond to that same set of questions, do you think that they would be able to do it? Let me say something before you answer that one about why I think this question matters. Because there's part of it about what we were just talking about with, earlier we were saying that we want to make sure everybody knows how to participate, that we want to make space for spirit to move, and so forth. But then also, I remember when I had first started going to a Quaker meeting, this would have been 2009. And I had been in worship for almost a year, and I wanted to try to become a member. And I didn't have the slightest idea how to become a member of the meeting. And I also had no idea who I should ask about how to become a member of the meeting. And so I asked a guy named John Edminster. And you know why I asked him? I asked him because he had the longest white beard out of everybody who was in worship. I don't know what my thought process was, why I assumed that would mean he would know things. But the reason I'm asking you this question is because when a newcomer or somebody who's trying something for the first time wants to know, how do I do X or Y? They are not necessarily going to go to the most knowledgeable person in the meeting to ask that question. So if they ask 3 different people, are they going to get 3 different answers about what the procedure is to get this idea tested or get this thing done? That's why I think this question matters. So what do you think? Do you think other people in your community could do this same exercise? A lot of you are looking kind of stuck, so I'm going to try this visually for a second. Give me a thumbs up if you're thinking, yes, absolutely they could. Give me one of these if you're like really not sure, and give me like an if you're thinking probably most of them couldn't. What do you think? Okay, so there's some thumbs up and some kind of shakies and some like, I'm really not sure they could. All right. Anybody want to say something verbally about this one? Susan.
I think it would depend on exactly what was in the list. If you took the list that you had, which actually didn't include membership, which is why I was surprised when that came up. I would think I know of a handful of people for sure who could answer it. And then there's probably a ripple effect where some are going to know something and then there'll be fewer and fewer for some of the things. But I think your point is extremely well taken about trying to be clear with people who are new, both to Quakerism, but also to the Quaker process and how we do business. I think that we probably, at least my meeting is trying hard, knowing that we don't do the job we want to do with that.
I appreciate that. And so the things that I had on the list were things that might theoretically be a trustee responsibility. Membership is not among those things. I don't think there's anywhere where trustees are responsible for membership, but it's the personal story that I have about being a newcomer who doesn't know and is just randomly asking people to try to figure this out. Kurt?
So I'm from Westerly, Rhode Island, monthly meeting, very small meeting. I would say we sort of going back to what the previous speaker said, we have a core group of people that know this really well. And they're also the ones that show up to business meeting all the time. So we still get people that don't come to business meetings, that some may be committee clerks in some cases, but they just don't show up for the meetings. They may know some, but nowhere near as much. And then there's a third level of people that don't know anything. So there is different levels of what actually for this answer of who they would go to and who's responsible for what.
Yeah. I noticed that Lori in the chat was also saying that there are a few people who could do that exercise, mostly older members of the meeting. And Timothy, I do see you. I'm going to come to you in a second. One of the things that we can do from a practical point of view, if you're sitting there going, no, I'm pretty sure we couldn't, probably a 2-hour information session for people to come to learn about how your meeting does things is not going to be the approach that's super effective with this one. But one of the things that you can do, even just you, even if nobody else in your meeting does this, is try to build in a personal practice of every time I am addressing the meeting for any purpose, I'm going to remember to add one sentence that is providing context or process information for people who might know it. Just one. So like after the meeting, we're having such and such gathering sponsored by Ministry and Council. Ministry and Council is the committee that is responsible for religious education in our group. It's that one sentence. When can I sneak in one sentence to give a little bit of procedural information to somebody who might not know? Timothy, and then I'll move to a different question.
Yeah, I sort of to echo what others have said and reiterate what you've just said. I think that the old timers, the folks that go to a business meeting regularly, probably could get 90%, of those items. There's still a few that we don't do a good enough job of clarifying, and so there's certainly room for improvement. But one of the things that we tried to do at our meeting is make regular announcements for some of these activities so that newcomers do know where to go for membership, or they do know how to give a donation, or all sorts of other things, and as in all things that sometimes doesn't get followed through on a regular basis. We have for our business meetings a process to where we regularly cycle through and make sure that we identify what all of those responsibilities are, but not everybody goes to business meeting. So doing that at just meeting for worship, I think is an important thing to remember. So thanks for that, juggling.
Confidence that answers are correct. I think that other people in their community can do this.
So I have an eye on the time. and I know what's in front of us, so I'm going to keep us going. But I'll just touch on these last two questions, which is the idea that it is not necessarily the case that every person in the community needs to know exactly who would respond to a lawsuit. It might not be the case that every single person in the community wants to have detailed information about who is managing the investments. It's good to make sure this information is available to everybody. But there is a point where we can go too far into giving people more information than they are actually wanting. So there is a piece about paying attention to how much are people wanting to know about division of responsibilities. The family that showed up last week maybe doesn't need the full information about the responsibilities of budget and collections. Unless they ask. So we're going to swing into one last piece here before we have a chance to do some discussion, which has to do with language. Most of the people who are on this call, not all of you, are trustees or have at some point been trustees. And it is very likely, although absolutely not a guarantee, that many of you are super comfortable with like data type thinking and budget type thinking and logistical type thinking. That's not universally true, but often people who serve in trustee roles are people who have that kind of mind, those types of gifts. And it can be really tricky when we're giving a report to a business meeting if the only language we're using is the data language, because it doesn't actually make sense to everybody there. So I want to talk to you about a report. This is just a made-up example, but a report that you're going to give in 5 different languages. We're going to look at 5 different ways of communicating information. Let's start with this one. This is the data story. And I'm going to go quiet for a minute. And when there is somebody here who thinks they can tell me, what do you see happening in this meeting? And you think you can say it in like 3 sentences, raise your hand. Marilyn.
I've seen it. It's called numbness.
Okay. Can somebody say a little bit more about what you see in the data? Like what is actually going on in this meeting? Let's try Anne Marie, because we haven't heard much from Anne Marie yet.
Well, I think that the meeting must be shrinking incredibly. All of its income has gone down. All of its staff costs have gone down. Its maintenance costs have gone down marginally, and its programs have diminished. So it must be a dying meeting, or they've all got too old or something.
Okay. I'm going to change slides and ask for something similar. Here's your visual story. So this is the same group of trustees making the same report. The first was data. This is your visual story. So when somebody would like to tell me, what do you see in the visual story? The red line, if it's too small to see, the red line is church costs, and the orange line is total endowment. Ron?
Yeah, so I mean, part of this is that I'm filling in from the data, but as donations went down, they had to dip into the principal to cover expenses. The dividend, not the dividends, but the interest income was no longer covering, along with donations, the expenses, so they had to spend capital in order to make ends meet. And that plus the church costs going down is austerity measures.
Mhm.
So they are, and it becomes a vicious cycle. They have less money in the endowment, so they start thinking, oh God, we have to do less, and so they start spending less on things, and you see that flat line in the last 2, 3, 4 years.
Great, thank you. All right, the next slide is easier because all I'm going to ask somebody to do is read it out loud. You don't have to interpret it. Would somebody read the logistical story out loud for us? Mio?
We've cut a lot of our costs since 2012. We moved from a 3/4 time pastor to a half-time pastor who's able to take a low salary because he's retired. We ended our vacation Bible school and the snack program for the local elementary school. We had some unexpected emergency maintenance with the plumbing back in 2016, but aside from that, we've kept our building costs as low as possible. Members of the meeting tell us that they are giving as generously as they can. Still, our endowment was $400,000 at the beginning of 2012, and now it's $264,000. Things might change, of course, but if they don't, we'll spend the last of our endowment in about 10 or 12 years. According to our handbook, the trustees don't decide about whether to spend down the endowment. The meeting does. So the meeting has a decision to make.
Thanks, Mio. So that's the logistical story. Here is what has happened. Here is what may happen next. Here's what we are thinking about. Would somebody read the emotional story? Jerry?
It was really hard losing Pastor Elizabeth. We all loved her a lot. So when she and her family moved on during COVID, that was something we had some grief about. If it wasn't easy canceling Vacation Bible School either. Lots of us had kids and grandkids that went through that program. I love coming to this building every Sunday. I met my wife right downstairs in the fellowship hall. And some of my best friends are in the book study group that happens in room 3 on Thursday nights. My neighbor got sober in the AA group that meets there. I worry about what will happen to the AA group and the book group and the worship if something has to change.
Thanks, Jerry. So we're telling the emotional story. We're using words like, it was hard, I love, I remember, I worry, and it's personal. Jerry is actually saying, pretending this is Jerry, like, these are the things I am feeling. These are my emotions in this moment. One more. Would somebody read the God story? Allison?
Trustees have power. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that. Trustees have prayer and open worship during every trustee meeting. We think about what God's doing in this meeting. We know that ever since this meeting started 200 years ago, God has called us to love each other and to be present in our neighborhood community, especially working with children. We have all those photos of Bible schools and work projects up on the wall by the entryway door, going back decades. We're wondering what God is calling us to now. We still have this building. We still have $264,000 in our endowment. And we still have amazing members of this meeting who have so many spiritual gifts. God has always given us what we need in the past, but now it looks like we won't have enough in the long term to keep doing what we've always done. So what's God saying? Has our calling changed or not? We don't know. Trustees can't figure that out by ourselves.
So we have now heard in this same report, we've heard 5 different languages. We heard the data story. We saw the visual story. We heard a logistical story. We heard an emotional story. We heard a God story. And as someone had said early on, this is a shrinking meeting. That's the report that's being given in this context. But your report could be about anything. Maybe you're trying to communicate that your meeting is growing. Maybe you're trying to communicate something about making a decision about how we will invest, and are we going to try to avoid investing in things related to fossil fuels? Maybe you're making a report that has to do with donating money to another organization, but you can still be using those 5 languages to communicate the thing that you're communicating. And then as we get to the end of the 5 languages, I suggest one specific query for the group. This tends to really help because otherwise it's hard for people to know how to respond. You just gave me a whole lot of information and I'm kind of stunned and I'm just sitting here and I don't know what you're wanting from me. We're not sure as trustees whether God is calling us to keep going like we are or to do something really different. So here's our question that we're hoping you'll give us some answers to in the next few minutes. How would our meeting know if God wanted us to make some big changes? There's nothing magical about that specific query, but I think there is something really helpful about having a specific query that's attached to a report like this. And then friends may also say other things, but it gives some kind of guidance for how to start grappling with what you've just heard. So just real quick, out of curiosity, I want you to imagine that you are sitting in the meeting receiving the report. So you're not giving the report, you're receiving the report. How many of you really like hearing or seeing the data story? Raise your hand if you find that really helpful. You like the data story. Okay. How many people really like seeing the visual story? Some kind of chart or graph or something. Who finds that helpful? Some of you do. How many people really like hearing the logistical story? First this happened, then that happened, then that happened. Okay. How many people like to hear the emotional story? This is how I'm feeling, this is how we may be feeling. How many people find it helpful to hear the God story? This is how we've been led in the past, this is how we might be led now. I don't know how many of you can see each other, but what was delightful to me in asking those questions was that I saw a different combination of hands go up each time. And most of you raised your hands 2 or 3 times, but some of you only once. I think that's why we tell the story multiple ways. Because the group of people we're talking to is not all going to respond to the same language. That's what I'm trying to talk about here. Are there 1 or 2 comments you're wanting to make on that topic before we move on? John.
None of these stories said in plain language what somebody identified from the data story. This is a shrinking meeting. And the question then becomes, what are we going to do about it?
Yep. I think that's a really good point. And I think that probably, if it is the first time you've talked about this, maybe the meeting is not ready to hear it in that kind of language yet. But maybe I'm wrong because I'm not in that meeting, so I don't know. But you're right. There was not like the straight plain speaking version of it. You're right. Jerry?
One of the things I was impressed with at a previous session, and I'm drawing a blank on the name of the person that raised this, but that there's a lot of value in having a narrative attached to anything that involves data, because the data alone really doesn't catch the attention of the people that we're speaking to.
Yeah. Yeah, when you're working in education circles, when you do studies on children, many of you have probably heard the multiple intelligences theory and the idea that some people learn through art and some people learn through music and some people learn through language. But what is actually the case when you look at a class of students is that all of them learn better when the information is presented multiple ways, regardless of their natural leanings. So I like what you're saying, Jerry, about having a narrative that's going along with the data, because when those two things come together, it's going to make more sense to everybody. I do want to give you a little time, as we usually do, to talk to each other. I'm going to remind you where we've been. We did a question about the spiritual grounding of policies and procedures. We talked about different types of relationships between trustees and organizations. We did that exercise with whose job in it is it and the relationships between committees and groups. And then we did the piece about languages. And I'm going to send you off in a moment to have a chance to meet each other and talk. And you'll be back in a little bit less than 20 minutes. And the question is, what is something that you heard tonight that you'd like your small group to help you think about more deeply? So you're just picking something that you are hoping your small group can talk with you more about and say, all right, so I want to think more about this piece of it that we heard, or I want to think more about that piece that we heard, and have a few minutes to dig into that. Are you ready to go? Okay, looks like you're ready to go. Della, I think you want to pause the recording.